And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Jiggers' Place. I'm your host Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every other Thursday afternoon or evening if you're on the East Coast to talk about everything that's not related to our financial lives. So we talk about relationships, like today, great books, the issues that affect our lives for good or for ill. So on today's show, here in the United States, there have been lots of discussions of late about the U.S. Constitution. What does it mean? What are its guidelines? And so I'm going to be talking about a book called the Federalist Papers, which is really the seminal text for understanding what the framers of the Constitution were trying to accomplish. And so in honor of that, my co-cocktail creator, ChatGPT, and I created the Federalist Cocktail. And I haven't tried it. I never tried these in advance, so you can get the pure reaction. But this is a cocktail made from Rye Whiskey. In this case, I'm using Templeton Rye, the 4-year-old variety. I know there's at least a 6-year-old because I've got that in my bar. And I think there's an 8 or a 10-year-old maybe. But in any event, this is just a great rye whiskey, just very, all the sort of best characteristics of it. They call it the good stuff. That's Templeton. And then we're going to be using Sweet Vermouth. So this is Martini Sweet Vermouth. It's been made since 1863 in Italy. This is also known as Italian vermouth. So generally speaking, there's 2 types of vermouth. There's French or dry vermouth, and there's Italian or sweet vermouth. Sweet vermouth is typically red in color, and although you can't see it in the green bottle, this is indeed red. And then we're going to be using an Amaro liqueur. Amaro means bitter. This happens to be R. Jelinek, and it comes from the Czech Republic. This is a pretty classic Amaro. It's been made since 1894. If you watch the show, you know my affinity for old things. And this brings back memories of being in Prague with my mother and our very long-standing friend, Sharon Cole. And then finally some Angostura bitters. So we've got our mixing glass with ice in it. And the first thing we're going to do is put in 1.5 ounces of whiskey. Where are my marks here? Well, they're hard to see. Nope, I think I'm going to use a different one. I'll use this one. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So 1.5 ounces, also known as a jigger. And you would think, well, Jiggers' Place, that must be named after a jigger of liquor. And no, that's not the case. Jiggers' Place is named after my dog, Jiggers. And I assure you he was not named after a measure of liquor. Okay, and then, let's see, 3/4 ounce of sweet vermouth. And 1/2 ounce of Amaro. By the way, if you want to get the cocktail recipes in advance so you can make them with me, so just sign up, go to my website and sign up for my email list, and you will get an email the morning before the show, and then 2 dashes of Angostura bitters. Okay. Oh, and I realized I forgot to make forgot to get a lemon twist. Okay, hang on 1 second. It's always better not to use refrigerated fruit for a cocktail, but I forgot to take it out in advance. Okay, so we're gonna stir the cocktail now, ice it down, and let some of the ice melt, which opens up the flavors. If you can see on the glass, it's got a frosty outside. You want to do this for about 20 to 30 seconds. Okay, that really gets it. That really does what it's supposed to do. Okay, and then we're going to use this. If you could see the recipe, it'd say use either a coupe or a rocks glass. I'm going to use a rocks glass for this case. We'll get our strainer out here, and we're going to strain it into a rocks glass, otherwise known as an old-fashioned. Makes one good cocktail. Okay, and here's my peeler. So we're going to take a lemon twist. Okay. It's a little bit too cold for it to be elegant. We're going to give it a twist with the drink, just to put some of the essence of the lemon juice in it. Rub my hands, and we're going to give it a taste. You know, it's kind of like a Manhattan. So, okay, I'll see you over on the couch. So I don't know, it's kind of a chilly day here. You know, it's springtime, and you would think that would mean that it's going to get warmer, but and it was supposed to be very warm on Tuesday, but it didn't. It didn't, and now it's chilly again. So I've got my electric fireplace on over here, so to add a little bit of warmth. So, as you know, I don't do politics. But I do understanding, as we say, and I think that it's important for us to understand the U.S. Constitution, especially if you're living in the United States. But so many other constitutions throughout the world are at least somewhat based on the U.S. Constitution. So. When the Constitution was drafted at the Constitutional Convention, the delegates, they knew what they were trying to accomplish, and they voted on the final draft. But then it had to be ratified by, at least three quarters of the original 13 states. So prior to the Constitution, the 13 states were held together by something called the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation did not create a strong central/federal government. And for many people, this raised some problems. And so that was why, in the end, a constitutional convention was convened and a constitution was drafted. And as is always the case in human endeavor, there were people who were
absolutely for it, almost no matter what. There were people absolutely against it, no matter what. And then the sort of bulk of the people were somewhere in the middle. And they were willing to make some compromises in order to establish, or in order to try and make the United States a stronger and better country. So once the Constitution was drafted, then the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, as well as the people who were most in favor of it, who became known as the Federalists, as opposed to those who were against it, who became known as the Anti-Federalists. Okay, they duked it out, as you will, over the issue of ratification. And in New York, the debate was particularly heated. And so three men, over the course of 1787, through 87 through 1788, they wrote a series of essays under the nom de plume, the name of pen name, publicists. And those 85 essays together have become known as the Federalist Papers. The three men who wrote them were Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. Now, and I have a few notes here, so I'm going to bring them over here, so if I can glance at them as I need to. So Alexander Hamilton wrote the bulk of them, 51. James Madison wrote 29, and John Jay wrote the other 5. And in the Federalist Papers, they talked about a wide number of issues, all related to why a stronger federal government was not only a good idea, but really a necessary idea. Cheers. So I read and somewhat reread the Federalist Papers earlier this year, and it surprised me how relevant these 200 and almost 230 plus year old documents are, in terms of their relevance to the issues that we're still debating today. And so I picked out 6 of them that I think are particularly relevant for, to talk about on this afternoon's show. But there's really no other way to know the Federalist Papers but to read them. So I know the last time I read them, I basically set a goal to read one each day. So it would take me roughly 3 months to read all of them. And in the event, I actually, in some cases, read more than one each day. I think it ended up taking me a little over 2 months to read the entire book, because I didn't want to rush through them on the one hand. On the other hand, it's not the most scintillating reading, frankly. It's not like reading a Horatio Hornblower novel that I talked about on the show on Tuesday, I think, and business lessons from the military. But they are well worth reading. They will truly enlighten you. And to give you an idea of how old this version of them was published, I want to say in the 80s, maybe. Does it say here? No, it doesn't. So this was the copyright on this version is 1961. I didn't get it in 1961 because I was 1 year old then. But this was probably something I picked up in probably the 1980s. And it's really a book that everyone should have, in their library. Obviously, these days you can get it online, all that kind of stuff. But in order to understand what our government is all about. Okay, so I'm going to talk about three aspects. First, on the need for the Constitution. The second is on the structure of the government, and the third is on the powers of the government. So first of all, on the need for the Constitution. So Federalist number 10, and it was written by James Madison. So he talks about the danger of factions being, groups who are angling for their own benefit. And they can be factions by geography. They can be factions by business or trade, farmers versus manufacturers, etc. They can be factions by political parties. And Madison argued that the creation of factions is just a factor of human existence. So George Washington, for example, he was very against political parties. He felt that we should always have a unity party in essence in this country. The reality, and while ideally that would be terrific, realistically, that's not how people behave. People are tribal, they're familial, excuse me, and to a certain extent selfish. And so there's always going to be this need to break into factions. And so Madison's idea in Federalist number 10 is the best way to deal with that is to have a large a large republic, so that there are a number of factions, and no single faction can gain hegemony over the entire country. So there always will be competing factions, and so therefore no faction will become permanently ascendant. And we see that even playing today. So both political parties to a certain extent seem to feel like if we only do this, we'll have an enduring majority for the rest of time, and then that turns out to be completely illusory. And for a while, populists reign, but then other groups come along. So farmers are ascended, and then manufacturers, and then inventors, and so all of these things, they vie back and forth, and so Madison's idea in Federalist number 10 has turned out to be correct, which is in a large republic, no one faction is going to become permanently ascendant. Okay, so that's Federalist number 1. In Federalist, excuse me, number 51. Madison again talks about checks and balances, and in it he explains what's come to be known as the separation of powers, right? So this is a fundamental idea that comes out of the U.S. Constitution. If you saw my show for Constitution Day, which is, I forget when that was, and toward the end of last year, I believe it was. I'll put a link to that show in the show notes for this one. So the federal government has 3 branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Each one has its own sphere in which it operates. So the executive branch is there to execute the laws. The legislature is there to create the laws, and the judicial branch is there to determine whether any particular action comports with the laws or not. Right. And so by separating these powers, now understand that in England, the tradition was basically all of those powers were held by the sovereign, by the king or queen. Right. Now, with the advent of Parliament, some of the legislative power was taken from the king and invested in Parliament. But at this time, the time that the Constitution was written, the King of England was a much more powerful individual than he is today, where King Charles is really just a figurehead. He has no executive, legislative, or judicial power today. But back when King George the Third, I believe it was on the throne during the American Revolution and thereafter, all of those powers were vested in him. And by the way, you still see that today in Great Britain, where when a new prime minister is selected, he goes to the king, and the king sort of, blesses him to, start, to form a new government. It's kind of a vestige of the way things used to be. But in fact, the king no longer confers any power on the prime minister. It's purely ceremonial today. So under Federalist number 51, the idea was that the ambition of one part of the government would be set against the ambition of the other. And so for example, if the president tried to become too powerful, started abusing the law, etc., so then Congress had the power in the House of Representatives to impeach the president. Okay, and if the president is impeached, then he's tried in the U.S. Senate, and if he's found guilty, he's removed from office. Now, that's only happened once in American history. Andrew Johnson was impeached and then also tried by the Senate and removed from office. There have been two other presidents who've been impeached, but they were not found guilty by the Senate, and so they weren't removed from office. And so that's a check on power. The justices of the Supreme Court are nominated by the president. They're confirmed by the Senate, okay, to serve for life. However, they are subject to impeachment, just like the president, okay? Now, what is the check on Congress? Well, the check on Congress is Congress can pass a law, but the president has to enact that law, has to execute that law. And if Congress passes a law that conflicts with the Constitution, the Supreme Court has the power of judicial review, and it can declare a particular law unconstitutional, right? So these are the checks and balances that are built into the federal government that Madison talked about in Federalist number 51, and it's really this sort of this structure of government of power competing against power that has, I think, to a certain extent, kept the American Republic enduring. Okay, now on to the structure of the government. So in Federalist 39, Madison again talks about the nature of the American government. So the American government is a federal government. So the checks and balances are not only lateral through the U.S. government, what's called the federal government as well, but there's another set of checks and balances. There's the horizontal ones that I just described, but there's also vertical checks and balances. So the states, the individual at that time 13, now 50 states, have power over the federal government as well. So the states send two senators, no matter their size, to the Senate, right? And then they send their representatives to the House of Representatives based on their population, okay? And that makes sure that the representatives to the federal government keep in mind the wants and needs of their constituents back home. So it's not the case where we have national elections for the members of the House of Representatives and the Senate. We don't. We have state elections, or we have elections, I should say state by state, and it's the representatives of the states that then convene in Washington to legislate laws and decide what's going to happen. Okay, now it used to be when the Constitution was first ratified that the state legislatures actually appointed senators to the U.S. Senate. And then at some point that switched to senators being elected by the citizens of each state. But nonetheless, you can see there's a very direct connection between the power conferred on the federal government by the individual states. And that's very important because otherwise small states, either small in landmass or small in landmass like Rhode Island, small in population like Wyoming, even though it's a huge state in landmass, they would be overrun by the large states like California, New York, Florida, Texas, Illinois, right? So this is an important aspect of the structure of the federal government, and it's something that helps keep the federal government responsible to us as individual citizens by way of the state in which we live. Okay, and another aspect of Federalist number 39 is the federal government. The federal government really operates by the consent of the governed, if you've ever heard that term. What it means is the federal government is responsible to those whom it governs, meaning to us, the people, right? In the United States, the sovereign power in the United States is the citizenry. It's the people who have the right to vote representatives in, to recall them, those kind of things, okay? Whereas in England, the sovereign is the king, or at least that time was the king, right? So Federalist number 39 emphasizes this idea of where the sovereign power lies, and it's with the people. Okay, Federalist number 78, which was written by Alexander Hamilton, talks about the judiciary specifically. And among the things that he does that Hamilton talks about in Federalist 78 is the idea of an independent judiciary. Okay, so this is very important. So whereas in England, as at the time, judges essentially served at the pleasure of the king, meaning that if the king didn't like what they were doing, he just fired them and get rid of them, and that was it. In the federal government, once a judge has been nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate, that judge serves for life. Okay, the president cannot remove him all by himself. He does not have that power. And in fact, the impeachment process, while it only takes a majority of members of the House of Representatives to impeach a judge, or for that matter, the president, conviction in the Senate takes a 2/3 majority, right? So it's very difficult to convict an impeached official, right? That's why it's only happened once in U.S. history, right? So, and by the way, going back to Richard Nixon, one of the reasons that Richard Nixon resigned was, although, and Richard Nixon, if you recall, was a Republican, although Democrats at that time did not have a 2/3 majority in the Senate, he was advised by a senior Republican senator that there were probably enough votes in the Senate to convict him. And so rather than being impeached and getting convicted in the Senate, it was better for the country for Richard Nixon to resign, which is in the end, I think, what compelled Richard Nixon to resign. So you can see, though, it's a very high barrier. It's very difficult to get a 2/3 majority, especially over something like the removal of a judge or the president from office. So, so that's what gives federal judges judicial independence. So, also in Federalist number 78, Hamilton talks about the idea of judicial review, which is the idea that the federal judiciary has the ability to essentially declare a law that's passed by the legislature, by Congress and the Senate, to be unconstitutional. Now, this is not a specified power in the Constitution, but it's an implied power. And it was first exercised in a case called Marbury versus Madison. And in that case that came before the Supreme Court really set the precedent for the idea that the Supreme Court can declare laws not to comport with the Constitution and therefore be unconstitutional. Okay, all right. So that's on the structure of the government, and then finally on the powers of the federal government. So in Federalist number 23, Hamilton talks about, among other things, national defense. So he argues that the federal government needs to have essentially unrestricted powers when it comes to issues like national defense, taxation, foreign policy, that that for the states, the individual states, to somehow have to vote on these issues or something becomes far too cumbersome. And so then the United States would always be such a fragile government that it could never really operate the country effectively. And so we see that pretty much today. So the President of the United States has very, very broad authority when it comes to the issues of national defense and foreign policy. One of the few checks on those powers is that it is up to Congress to declare a war. So this has been very controversial over the last, I would say, 30, 35 years, where presidents have increasingly taken military actions that look like war, but they don't call them a war. They don't get a war declaration from Congress. And so they're evidently not wars, right? And this is problematic. If you recall, going back to World War II, after Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the next day, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, went to Congress and asked for a declaration of war against both Japan and Germany. And by the way, that was controversial because it was Japan that attacked at Pearl Harbor. Germany hadn't aside from some shipping contretemps, Germany was not in active combat with the United States. Nonetheless, FDR decided to ask for a declaration of war against both members of the Axis. And in fact, we went more directly to war with Germany before we did Japan, after Congress voted in favor of that declaration of war. There was only, in fact, one dissenting vote on that declaration. That is the last time that the United States took military action on an actual declaration of war. So the Korean conflict was not a declared war. That's why although it's called the Korean War, many people like me call it the Korean conflict because it was not a declared war. The Vietnam War was also not a declared war. And all the military action subsequent to that. So this has been controversial, for decades. But the president does have very broad power when it comes to defense and foreign policy. Congress, on the other hand, has broad power to tax. So while the Constitution did not give the Congress the ability to levy an income tax, the Constitution was amended in the 1930s to do that. Still, Congress had the ability to levy tariffs, excise taxes, many other types of taxes that it used to support the federal government. So again, there were people in the anti-federalist faction that did not want Congress to have the authority to levy taxation. They wanted that to remain with the states. But the concern was that the states would essentially always vote against it, and they would starve the federal government of revenue and thereby make it completely ineffective, right? So the Constitution gave Congress the authority to levy taxes, pretty much unfettered by the states. Okay, so that's Federalist number 23. But you can see, by the way, that it's the idea of the Constitution was it gave broad powers, but only in certain areas. Now, today it seems like the federal government can do whatever it wants, and this is one of the controversies that is really coming to a head now that President Trump has come back into office, and he's working to cut the federal government, get it out of many areas in which it's involved. For example, the Department of Education. And his opponents are saying the federal government has to be involved with these things. So many of these issues, if not all of them, I think will eventually end up in front of the Supreme Court, and they'll decide what is constitutional and what is not. Okay, so originally the Constitution was delegating only specific powers to the federal government. It seems like over the centuries, those powers have broadened, and now we're seeing an effort to shrink them, and we'll have to see how that works out. And then finally, Federalist number 70, written by Alexander Hamilton, talks specifically about the executive branch, and it makes the case for an energetic executive. In other words, a president who really takes the bull by the horns and really makes the federal government operate, whether it's in foreign policy, whether it's in defense policy, whatever it is. He makes the case we need a strong president. Now, there were many states who wanted to see a weak president. They didn't want to be eclipsed by the federal government. And the countervailing argument was, we need a strong president in order to have a strong central government, in order for the United States to be a strong country on the world stage. And over the last roughly 250 years, we've seen times when the president has gotten much more powerful and Congress has sort of usurped has allowed its authority to be usurped. And there have been other times when the president's power has waned and Congress has taken much more power. So in the wake of President Nixon's resignation, for example, Congress became much more powerful than it had been previously. So under President Eisenhower and President Kennedy, the presidency had become much stronger, much more energetic than it had been. I mean, it was very energetic under FDR. It atrophied somewhat under Truman, became energetic a little bit more under Eisenhower. And then under Kennedy, it really became much more energetic. And then during Nixon's time in office, he kind of took over from Kennedy, but then Congress sort of pulled back a lot of its power after the resignation of Richard Nixon. And then throughout the Carter years, Carter was a relatively not energetic president. And then when Ronald Reagan was elected, he sort of re-energized the presidency. So you see this sort of up and down flowing of presidents and presidential power, congressional power, and that ebbs and flows depending on what's going on in the country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Hamilton's argument in Federalist number 70 was, we need an energetic president. especially in foreign affairs, to make sure that we are competitive with other nations, and to make sure, in essence, that the United States doesn't get trampled. Now, I didn't talk about this specifically, but I don't remember which Federalist paper it's in. When I did my research, I couldn't find it. But one of the aspects of the balance of powers and an energetic Congress versus an energetic presidency, there's this third branch, the judiciary. So the judiciary can never be energetic per se. And that's because the federal judiciary can only act on the cases that are brought before it. It cannot call a matter before it on its own, cognizance, if you will. Okay. So in some ways, this makes the judiciary the weakest branch of the federal government, because it cannot initiate action on its own volition. Okay. On the other hand, because it can essentially cancel a law that it deems to be unconstitutional, it wields a tremendous amount of power. So you see kind of a balancing act there as well. Power on a more sort of day-to-day basis, not day-to-day basis, power sort of over time waxes and wanes between the president and Congress. And then you've got the judiciary kind of here undergirding things, but it might spike up all of a sudden if it finds a law to be unconstitutional, or it finds a controversial law to be constitutional. It kind of spikes up, and then it kind of goes back down. And unless something really controversial is brought before it, it kind of hangs out down here. So that's an aspect of the federal government as well that's well worth understanding. So again, going back to what I said at the beginning of the show, I think it's very important that we understand the constitutional structure of our government. Those of us who are Americans, and for people who are not, and maybe they're in other countries, they have a constitution that's similar to ours. So it's good to understand the foundations of the American Constitution, and it gives us a foundation for cogent debate. No matter where we sit on the political spectrum, it's best to be able to discuss issues with a foundation of knowledge underneath them, rather than just spouting our opinions. Our opinions are fine, but our opinions unsupported by evidence, by what's the word I'm looking for? All of a sudden, I'm losing it. By evidence, by reasoned conclusions, and by this sort of history of the Constitution, I think is not particularly powerful or persuasive. So I encourage you to read the Federalist Papers. Like I said, if you do what I did, you read one an evening, and it probably takes you, between, some of you can read in 5 minutes, they're so short, but most you're going to read between 10 and 20 minutes to read it. Take 10 or 20 minutes a day for approximately 3 months, and you will gain a much deeper understanding of the Constitution and a much deeper appreciation for the United States of America. So I thank you so much for joining me. You may have noticed I haven't been drinking too much of my cocktail. Not as good as some of them have been. That's how it goes. I'd be curious if you made yourself the Federalist Cocktail, what you think of it. All the links to my social media will be in the show notes after this episode posts on YouTube. So I encourage you to let me know what you think. And if you have any personal thoughts, my email address is there as well. Feel free to send me an email. And this is my last show for this week. And so before signing off, just a reminder, next week on Monday at 10 a.m. is my show, Trust and Estates Weekly. My guest is Jolene Blackburn. Jolene is an estate planning attorney, and she's going to talk about an aspect of estate planning that is very commonly overlooked. So really looking forward to having a conversation with Jolene. On Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, Business Lessons from the Military. And let's see, what am I talking about on Tuesday? I just did the promos for it. I don't remember. And then on Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money. And I'm going to be talking about John Wooden. Now, many of you may know I'm a Trojan, and you may be thinking, why are you talking about one of the greatest UCLA coaches who ever lived? Well, I was fortunate to hear John Wooden speak in person when I was younger. He is a captivating speaker. He is not just a great coach. He was not just a great coach, but a great man, incredibly inspiring. And he has a tremendous amount of wisdom that will help us in our lives, and especially in our business and professional lives. So kind of a tribute to this amazing man. I'm going to talk about some of John Wooden's ideas on people making money Wednesday, 10 a.m. next week. So again, thanks so much for tuning in and sharing a schmooze, as we say in Yiddish, and a cocktail. Especially those of you watching live, thanks so much. And I really appreciate it. And wishing you a wonderful evening, a wonderful rest of the week and weekend. Looking forward to seeing you next week. Signing off as I always do, Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage at all times, my friends.